Değerli üyelerimiz, kıymetli katılımcılar, öncelikle webinarımıza hoş geldiniz demek istiyorum. Hepinizi SKD Türkiye adına saygıyla selamlıyorum. Bildiğiniz gibi SKD Türkiye olarak kurulduğumuz yıl olan 2004'ten beri sürdürülebilir bir dünya için iş dünyasına rehberlik eden faaliyetler yürütüyoruz. Çatı örgütümüz Dünya Sürdürülebilir Kalkınma İş Konseyi WBCSD ile işbirliğimizin getirdiği sürdürülebilirlik birikimini çalışma gruplarımız ve yürüttüğümüz faaliyetler aracılığıyla üyelerimize ve paydaşlarımıza aktarıyoruz. Bu doğrultuda bugün ülkemizin 2053 net sıfır emisyon hedefine ulaşmasına katkı sağlayacak çalışmalarımızda yeni bir hareket başlatmanın heyecanını sizlerle paylaşıyoruz. SKD Türkiye olarak Hedef Net Sıfır Karbon sloganıyla üyelerimiz arasında başlattığımız Net Sıfır Karbon Hareketinde çatı örgütümüz WBCSD tarafından yayınlanan SOS 1.5 Net Sıfır Karbon İçin Yol Haritası bizlere önemli bir rehber olacak. Birazdan şirketlerin net sıfır karbon hedefine ulaşma yolculuğuna başlamasına ve bu yolculukta ilerlemesine yardımcı olacak 5 ana adım ve 16 eylemden oluşan SOS 1.5 Net Sıfır Karbon için Yol Haritası'nın detaylarını hep birlikte dinleyeceğiz. İklim çalışmaları yürüten şirketlerin görüş ve önerileriyle geliştirilen bu rehber, üyelerimiz arasında başlattığımız Net Sıfır Karbon hareketinde önemli adımlar içeriyor. Yönetim kurulu üyemiz, düşük karbon ekonomisine geçiş ve verimlilik odak alanımızın eş başkanı, aynı zamanda Sabancı Holding İnsan Kaynakları ve Sürdürülebilirlik Grup Başkanı Hakan Timur, bugün bizlerle beraber. Enerji dönüşümü konusunda önemli çalışmalar yürüten 60 ülkede faaliyet gösteren Wood PLC'nin başkanı Doktor Damon Hill birazdan konuşmasını yapacak. Aynı zamanda çatı örgütümüz WBCSD'den İklim Aksiyonları Müdürü Hannah Locke var aramızda. Toplantımızın kapanışını da Yönetim Kurulu Başkanımız Ebru Dildar Edin yapacak. Ben webinarımızı kaydettiğimizi ve yabancı konuşmacılarımız için tercüme imkanı bulunduğunu da belirtmek istiyorum. Evet, kıymetli katılımcılar, tüm dünya iklim krizi nedeniyle büyük bir mücadele veriyor. Bu doğrultuda Türkiye'nin 2053 net sıfır emisyon hedefi ülkemizin iklim kriziyle mücadelesinde önemli bir süreç. Net Sıfır Karbon Hareketi'nin bu süreçte görev üstlenmek isteyen şirketlerimizi daha da cesaretlendireceğine inanıyoruz. SKD Türkiye olarak bu yolculukta başta üyelerimiz olmak üzere şirketlere rehberlik etmek için büyük bir heyecan duyuyoruz. Bu heyecanı bizlerle paylaştığınız için teşekkür ederiz. Şimdi sözü açılış konuşmasını yapmak üzere Yönetim Kurulu üyemiz ve düşük karbon ekonomisine geçiş ve verimlilik odak alanımızın eş başkanı Sabancı Holding İnsan Kaynakları ve Sürdürülebilirlik Grup Başkanı Hakan Timur'a bırakıyorum. Buyurun Hakan Bey.
Gonca Hanım, çok teşekkür ederim. Ben de öncelikle tüm katılımcıları ve değerli konuşmacılarımızı sevgi ve saygıyla selamlıyorum. Buradaki herkesin gerçekten son derece vakıf olduğuna inandığım ve takip ettiğine inandığım şeyleri tekrar etmeyeceğim. Ancak sürdürülebilir bir dünya ve var etmek zorunda olduğumuz gelecek için iklim acil durumu ve bu çerçevede ülkeler, kurumlar, şirketler, hatta bireyler olarak atmamız gereken acil adımların olduğu muhakkak. Yani bu konuda harekete geçmemenin ve global anlamdaki sıcaklık artışını 1,5 derecenin altında tutmamanın hem ekonomik, hem sosyal, hem insani sonuçlarının çok büyük olduğunu gerçekten hepimiz iyi biliyoruz. Tabii burada atılacak adımlar derken buraya giden yolda yine eminim ki hepimiz bunun vakıfız ve çok iyi biliyoruz ki global anlamda da karbon emisyonlarımızı azaltmak ve hem de bunu radikal bir biçimde azaltmak bu amaca ulaşmak açısından en önemli konulardan bir tanesi. Bugünkü verilere bakarsak eğer 2100 yılına bugünkü performansla ya da bugünkü durumla gidersek ki zaten eğer bugünkü durum devam ederse 2100'ü görebilir miyiz? O da belki ayrı bir konudur ama bugünkü performans ya da bugünkü durum diye baktığımızda 2100'lerde 4 dereceleri konuşuyoruz ki Bu zaten yani ne kabul edilebilir ne de hem dünya hem de yaşam anlamında katastrofik şeyler anlamına geliyor. Tabii bir de pozitif taraftan da bakalım. Pozitif taraftan da bakarsak gerek Paris Anlaşması, Green Deal ve özellikle de son COP toplantısının akabinde bu konuda global anlamda da hem yapılan açıklamalar hem de yavaş yavaş ortaya konulan hedefler ve aksiyonlar boyutundan baktığımızda da gittikçe daha da konunun önemine binaen adımların ve niyetlerin çok daha esasında pozitif yönde iyileştiğini de görüyoruz. Özellikle ülkeler anlamında da. Buna tabii ki ülkemiz de dahildir. Bu anlamda ülkemizde de yakın zamanda hem hedefler anlamında hem de Paris Anlaşması anlamında çok olumlu adımlar atıldı. Bunu hepimiz biliyoruz. Ancak global anlamda baktığımızda daha ülkeler açısından da hem hedefler hem de bu hedefleri gerçekleştirmek açısından daha atılması gereken, yapılması gereken çok şey var. Tabii bir tarafta ülkeler diye bakıyoruz ama ülkeler ve hedefler derken aynı zamanda biz de ülkeler ve ülke politikalarının yanında kurumlar olarak da, şirketler olarak da atacağımız adımları tabii ki iyi belirlemeliyiz. Bu anlamda hassas olmalıyız ve bu konuda da üstümüze düşen görevleri de yerine getirmeliyiz. Bu anlamdaki katkılarımızın da çok çok önemli olduğunu düşünüyorum. Ve Sürdürülebilir Kalkınma Derneği Türkiye olarak da yani bu konuda açıkçası geniş ürün yelpazemizle de aynı zamanda ülkedeki kamuoyu anlamında da gerek hassasiyeti oluşturmak, gerekse bu konuda atılacak adımları daha ivmelendirmek için elimizden geleni yapıyoruz. Bizim kendi bu çalışma grubu olarak ve dernek olarak kendi üyelerimiz ki geniş bir esasında üye kitlemiz de var yaptığımız adımlarda. Bir kere kurumlar ya da şirketler nezdinde de karbon, net sıfır karbon yolculuğunda birçok şirketin artık hedef belirleme, hedef koyma, strateji koyma aşamasında olduğunu görüyoruz. Ben bizim grubumuz açısından da söylüyorum. Bu anlamda da bu konuda çok net adımlarıyla da hedefini koyan ilk holding olmaktan da mutluyuz. Ama aynı zamanda üyelerimiz açısından baktığımızda da bu konuda da birçok adımın atılmak konusundaki niyeti, isteği ve stratejik olarak şirketlerimizin gündeminde olduğunu bunu görüyoruz üyelerimizin. Fakat yine yaptığımız araştırmalarda iki tane şeyi de gösteriyor. Hala esasında Türkiye'deki birçok şirket de bu konuda daha hedef koyma ya da doğru bir hedefi belirleme aşamasında ya da hedef belirlediyse de buraya giden yolda neler yapması gerektiği, ne tür aksiyonlar alması gerektiği konusunda çok daha net bir yol planına ve bir takım bazı desteklere ihtiyacı var. İşte Sürdürülebilir Kalkınma Derneği Türkiye olarak da bu anlamdaki kuruluş misyonumuz ve yönetim kurulumuzun, yönetim kurulu başkanımız Ebru Hanım da dahil olmak üzere belirlediğimiz yol planı çerçevesinde tabii üyelerimize hatta Türkiye genelinde de bu anlamda destek olmak, yardımcı olmak, bir yol açmak ve yol planlarını oluşturmak konusunda da faydalı olma amacındayız. Bu anlamda da işte bugünkü bu yaptığımız toplantı özellikle demin Gonca Hanım da bahsetti. Çatı kuruluşumuz WBCSD babında da yapılan özellikle SOS 1.5 projesi ve lansmanı da bu anlamda çok önemli. Bu vesileyle ben de bugünkü konuşmacılarımızı da Damon'a da Ena'ya da tekrar bizlerle birlikte oldukları için çok teşekkür ediyorum. Çünkü bugünkü bu lansmanı önemsiyoruz. Çünkü SOS 1.5 esasında projesinin ve bizim de şu anda Türkiye'de lansmanını yaparak burada paylaştığımız ve bundan sonraki adımları atacağımız konu şirketlerimizin sektörlerinden bağımsız net sıfır karbon hedeflerini ortaya koymaları, bu hedefleri ortaya koyarken de bu hedefe doğru giderken doğru yol planları geliştirmeleri, ne tür aksiyonlar almaları gerektiği konusunda da desteklemeyi, onlara bu konudaki iyi örnekleri göstermeyi ve bakmaları gereken, hassasiyetle üzerinde durmaları gereken konular konusunda da dediğim gibi yol açmayı ve yol gösterici olmayı planlıyor, amaçlıyor. Bu anlamda da çok hem bugünkü toplantının hem bundan sonraki aksiyonlarımızın da çok faydalı olacağını umut ediyoruz. Ve Sürdürülebilir Kalkınma Derneği olarak da bu konuda gerek üyelerimiz, gerekse ülkemizin net sıfır karbon yolculuğunda gerektiğinde onlara doğru şekilde yol göstermek ama gerektiğinde de bilgi olarak, benchmark olarak uluslararası anlamda da doğru örnekleri göstererek, bir araya getirerek, hatta zaman zaman da çeşitli raporlar ve raporlamalarla destek olmak, yardımcı olmak ve bu konudaki adımların Türkiye'de önemli bir parçası olmak ve hep birlikte topyekün gerçekleştireceğimiz bu radikal değişimin, dönüşümün sizlerle birlikte bir parçası olmaktan mutluluk duyacağımızı ve burada her zaman var olacağımızı da sanıyorum yönetim kurulumuz ve derneğimizin misyonu açısından da belirtmekte bir beis yok. Bunu da gönül rahatlığıyla paylaşmak istiyorum. Dediğim gibi hem sizlere katılımınız için, hem konuşmacılarımızın bugün paylaşacağı çok çok önemli bilgiler için, hem de bundan sonra umut ediyorum ki Sürdürülebilir Kalkınma Derneği Türkiye, tüm üyelerimiz, hatta diğer bundan faydalanmak isteyen tüm kuruluşlarla beraber gerçekleştireceğimiz bu net sıfır karbon yolculuğunda birlikte hareket etmekten ve birlikte güzel sonuçları almaktan mutluluk duyacağız. İnşallah bunu hep birlikte başaracağız diyorum. Daha da fazla uzatmadan sözü Gonca Hanım'a ve değerli konuşmacılarımıza bırakmak istiyorum. Hepinize tekrar sevgi ve saygılarımla.
Hakan Bey, çok teşekkür ederiz. Gerçekten yönetim kurulumuz ve düşük karbon ekonomisine geçiş ve verimlilik odak alanı eş başkanımız olarak harika bir ufuk çizdiniz bize. Tekrar teşekkürler. Evet, şimdi sırada konuk konuşmacımız var. Konuk konuşmacımız Dr. Damon Hill, Wood PLC'nin başkanı. Wood PLC özellikle enerji dönüşümü konusunda çok önemli çalışmalar yapıyor. Ben şimdi sözü Damon'a bırakacağım. Bildiğiniz gibi tercümemiz var. Eğer Türkçe olarak dinlemek isterseniz Almanca kanalından dinleyebilirsiniz. Damon, welcome. I have just introduced you.
Thank you, Kansa. I'll start sharing my screen.
The floor is yours. Thank you.
Okay, I'll start sharing my screen if I may. Just 1 second.
We see your screen, no problem, Damon. Yes, it's in the presentation mode as well. Thank you.
Excellent. Okay. So first of all, I'd just like to say a big thank you to BCSD Turkey for inviting me to talk today. My name is Damon Hill, and I'm President of Growth and Business Development for the projects part of Wood. Just a little bit about Wood. Wood is really an expert services provider, predominantly working in energy and the sustainable infrastructure markets globally. We have three business units: consulting, projects, and operations. And it's about overall, it's about an $8 billion company with 45,000 people. And I can tell you, energy transition and circular economy are incredibly important themes that I am passionate about personally, and my company is. And we're doing an awful lot of work and have been for a number of years on this. So it's a huge topic, of course. Today, in the time available, I'm just going to touch on 3 areas that I think are really important. One is our structured approach to decarbonisation. I'm going to talk a little bit about technology around carbon capture, and then finally something that I'm sure you've all heard about, which is the hydrogen economy and the hydrogen revolution. So moving on, we like to, when we have presentations, we like to have a safety moment, and this is really an unusual one, but it's certainly a safety moment. You know, at the moment, CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere are at their highest levels in over 800,000 years. As a result, the planet is warmer now than it's been in 120,000 years. Now, obviously, energy consumption and product demand starts with us as individuals. So, although there's a huge amount of work that needs to be done and driven by governments and private industry, using the technologies and the expertise that I'll describe in a minute, it starts with us. It starts with our demand and our use of products and energy. And in the next 20 years, we've got another 2 billion people going to be on the planet. And there's a huge urbanization, particularly in Asia, as I'm sure you're aware, and standards of living are increasing. You know, we don't want them to decline, and in most parts of the world they're increasing. So that drives a huge increase in energy demand and a huge increase in product demand. So it is really important that we address this right now. In 2015, the governments got together in Paris, and the agreement and acknowledged that their national climate targets were not going to meet the goal of 1.5 C. I myself attended COP26 last October, and although there's been huge improvements and drive forward, we're still not going to achieve that unless there's some fundamental changes in how we drive the use of energy in particular. There's been, as I'm sure you've seen, a huge pressure on companies by shareholders and by investment funds. So there's big risks in being introduced into companies now unless they address this. My company, we provide solutions for the asset owners like ExxonMobil and Shell and pharmaceutical companies and everything in the energy sector. But we also are driving new sustainability targets within our own company and what we do. I think one thing that I would like to highlight here is it's a hugely difficult target, the 1.5 by 2050. But what is very clear is that there's absolutely no way we can achieve that unless we have collaboration, and particularly between governments and private industry. We need to leverage all of the expertise, all the technologies we have, and we need to apply them selectively across the world. Different geographies will have different solutions, of course. So moving on to my first real topic of decarbonisation. Decarbonising assets, or for some clients, multiple assets, is incredibly complex because everything is generally driven by economics. So clients, when they're making an investment, would prefer to get a positive return on investment. Of course, when you're applying a carbon capture or decarbonisation, usually these things are often driven by legislation, and often there is not a positive return on investment. So if clients have to apply this, they still want to apply it in the most efficient way they can to get the best return for the money they're spending. So what we've developed, we have something that we've had for many, many years called asset master planning. And we've applied that to decarbonisation. We've taken our master planning approach, which is how we design and optimise one or multiple assets for a client, create a roadmap so that they have an investment roadmap over a period of years that is optimised. And we've turned that into something that can be applied incredibly effectively for, as I say, one or multiple assets. And this we've called SCORE. And the most important thing here is that when you apply the expertise, you apply the structure so that it's easy for clients to make decisions, very, very important economic decisions. And SCORE is really, the terminology is taken from substitute, capture, offset, reduce, and then evaluate. But before that, we have an advise. That's in the assess, but in the advise phase, we look at setting targets and criteria for the assess phase. So if we look at the client's assets, now a client, as I say, might have a single asset, and that's relatively simple. But many of our clients that we're working for have multiple assets, and it may be across a country or it may be across multiple countries. And we can apply this methodology, and we are at the moment, across any number of assets so that you create the optimized roadmap for decarbonisation investments. So what we do with a client is we build the target setting and the criteria by looking forward about policy that's likely to impact the assets in any particular region. We look at market analysis because of course feedstock pricing and product pricing is still incredibly important for any asset, whatever it's producing, whether it's manufacturing, refining, petrochemicals, oil and gas, or pharmaceuticals, any asset, pulp and paper, it doesn't matter. You can apply this to any asset. We do the baseline audit so that we know exactly what the basis of each asset is in terms of its carbon footprint. And then we feed in the corporate strategy and the objectives to create this target setting and this criteria. We then apply real subject matter experts for those specific assets to look at how you can decrease the carbon footprint of the assets, and which assets have the best return, if you like, and are the ones that you get the best return get against your criteria, and those are the ones you put on the roadmap first. But we look at the criteria of substitute, capture, offset, and reduce. We look at technical and economic analysis, and then we create the roadmap. And then, of course, you've got the roadmap of investment, and then you deliver it through over a number of years. So what sort of, just to give some examples of substitute, capture, offset, and reduce, and we are looking at scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 for many clients. I'm sure you're familiar with those. Those scope 1 really looks just at the asset. Scope 2 looks at the power supply and its surrounding. And then scope 3 looks at the whole life cycle of the feedstock through to the products. But for a typical downstream asset, these are the kind of things that we look at, looking at analysing the economics and the feasibility, technical feasibility. So biofeedstocks, bioblending in substitute. In capture, obviously, well, typically capture comes last, because what you're looking to do is you're looking to substitute and increase and reduce primarily. So reduce is where you get optimize the asset, reduce the energy consumptions. An offset can mean a lot of things within the asset and across multiple assets and outside the asset. The capture, as I say, is where you actually put carbon, which I'm just about to talk about, carbon capture technologies usually we look at an 80-20, because there are usually some very high carbon dioxide emitters, and those are the ones you target first. So moving on to carbon capture, utilization, and sequestration, CCUS. What is CCUS? Well, it's really two parts. Carbon capture and storage is the carbon capture, which I'll talk about technologies in a minute, and then typically compressing, putting down a pipeline, and then having some form of aquifer or existing oil field or gas field that you can actually pump the CO2 in a safe manner to store it. Utilization is obviously better. It's obviously, with the amounts of carbon dioxide we're talking about, it's hard to utilize all of it, but there are things you can use carbon dioxide for. Cement production, actually storage of foodstuffs uses carbon dioxide, fizzy drinks. So there are, in some parts of the world where there's a local utilizer, you can actually use utilization as well. But it's usually CCS when we're trying to when we're looking at how quickly can we rectify this problem that we have. CCS is usually a much higher capacity solution. And this is typically what it looks like. I've given an example of a project we're actually working on in the UK. We're working on these projects all over the world, but this is a very real one, a very big one, and it's taking carbon dioxide streams from a multitude of different assets, power stations, refineries, manufacturing. It's bringing those CO2 streams together. It's then compressing and then sending down a pipeline and into an existing depleted oil field. So you've got CO2, you've got those three steps, if you like: CO2 capture, and there's post-combustion, pre-combustion, and oxy combustion are the typical technologies, and I'll talk about those in a second. There's CO2 transportation, and that is quite complex. CO2 is not an easy thing to transport, certainly by pipeline, so it needs real expertise. And then the storage, again, it's something that needs to be really carefully designed and managed. And this is obviously a very, very quick fix, potentially over the next decade or so. Longer term, using more and more renewables, then the CO2 problem should become much lower, and CO2 storage in aquifers and depleted reservoirs will be less critical. So talking about the three types of carbon capture, probably the most prevalent, and what will be the most prevalent going forward, is post-combustion. And these are proven technologies, solvent-based, taking the CO2 and other acid gases out of a gas stream. And these have been in operation for decades. There's nothing new here. They're well known. It really is just a matter of applying them and spending the money to apply them to all the assets that we have that are currently emitting CO2. In the interest of time, I'm going to go through these relatively quickly. Basically, you can apply this. One of the main areas, of course, is to power stations and power production. But we also apply these to refineries, which have a lot of power on site. They have a lot of boilers. They have some process units on refineries, like hydrogen units, and fluid cat crackers produce a lot of CO2. So there's some very high CO2 concentration streams that we can target. And as I say, these solutions are well proven and they are highly effective. They capture well over 95% CO2. So they can be incredibly successful in decreasing carbon footprint on pretty much any asset with a high CO2 emission. So when you think about that, this is something that can be applied immediately. I mean, it takes a few years to actually design and build these bolt-on solutions, but there's nothing stopping companies that own and run these assets from actually doing it, apart from pure economics, because somebody has to pay for it. So pre-combustion CO2 is a little bit more specialized. Again, the technologies are very proven and have been successful operation for many decades. CO2 is sometimes, well, often actually, a big constituent of, say, a natural gas stream. And so there are technologies, again, solvent-based, that take out the CO2 so that you can, what we call gas conditioning. But then there's also, you take it a step further, and so you can take out the CO2 that might be in the feed stream, but take it a step further and you can actually break the hydrocarbon molecule so that you take say the simplest one is methane, you can actually break it to produce pure hydrogen and CO2. And then you can capture the CO2 very, very efficiently. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that, because one of the actual technologies involved in that is in blue hydrogen, which is one of the technologies that we at Wood have a leading position in. But these are the kind of applications that we already use pre-combustion CO2 in. And so again, this is a bit more selective in its use, but it's well proven. There's nothing stopping asset owners applying this where it's relevant, and it's purely economics and who pays for it that is slowing the adoption of these things. And then finally, something a little bit newer is Oxy Combustion. And really what this is it's really just, the only difference really is that instead of using just air for combustion when you're generating energy and power, you actually you separate the air, the oxygen from the air using an air separation unit, and you use pure oxygen. And what that does is it gives you a much higher concentration of CO2 in the flue gas, and so you can get a much higher efficiency in the capture of CO2. So this is a variation on post combustion capture, but looks very, very promising in improving the efficiency of the capture. And just to finish on carbon capture, utilization and sequestration, where do we operate? Where does Wood have expertise in this? Well, we operate right the way across, right the life cycle. So carbon capture, we don't have our own technology, but what we do is we have experts, process and engineering experts in the technologies. There are various licensed technologies out there, and we have expertise in all of them. So we can help clients select the right technology for their particular application. We can optimize it, design, integrate it, and then obviously build it. And we can also operate it. We have expertise through our pipeline simulation and flow assurance teams in transportation. And in the storage side, we also have expertise in our consulting teams. We don't operate reservoirs, but we do have expertise in our consulting groups in helping clients to optimize the storage side as well. So finally, I just want to take just literally a couple of minutes talking about hydrogen, because this is one of the most exciting things that we're involved in. I'm sure you've heard, I'm sure you've heard all of the different colors. There's even a pink hydrogen, but the ones I'll talk about primarily will be gray, blue, green, and bio, because the pink is using nuclear power for the future, which is a variation on green. And there are others, but the main ones are the current ones that are prevalent in the world is grey hydrogen, and that's typically using what we call a steam methane reformer, which is a very established technology. We at Wood have one of the world's leading technologies. We were pioneering and developing it in the 1960s. Very, very advanced technology, which basically takes a hydrocarbon feedstock and turns it into hydrogen. Now, by capturing the CO2, what we've done is we've spent a lot of money on research and development over the last 2 or 3 years, and we've integrated carbon capture and a higher level of efficiency into our steam methane reforming hydrogen production unit. And that's blue hydrogen because it captures the carbon dioxide. You still then need to obviously transport the carbon dioxide and put it somewhere, so into an aquifer or a depleted field. But that is a very, very high efficient CO2 capture of 95, 96%. And then the one that's really in the press a lot is green hydrogen. Now, this is using electrolysis and renewable power to drive the electrolysis. It's relatively new. The electrolyzers, we're doing multiple projects currently around the world for clients, actually on all of these, grey, blue and green. The thing to remember about green is, and with electrification generally, is it's driving, there are some drawbacks. And one of the things, just by way of example, the huge demand for minerals is going to drive, just to meet electrification and electrolysis and green hydrogen being a part of that, and renewable power. It's going to drive the mining and minerals business to have to grow by a factor of 6 as a minimum within the next 15 to 20 years. So there are huge life cycle impacts in green hydrogen and renewable power, the growth that we need. The other thing is that's always a concern with green is it does use huge amounts of fresh water. So when you look at, I've got various maps of the world that looks at the water situation, and I'm sure you're all aware, water we're very lucky in our part of the world, on the European continent, that we tend to have an abundance of water and fresh water. But in many, many parts of the world, water is a very, very scarce a commodity. And so it is a challenge in many parts of the world whether green hydrogen is something that is viable purely because of the water. But yeah, the traditional use of hydrogen is in refining and downstream fertilizer and ammonia plants, and selectively in other uses. But tomorrow's use, and already we're building these things, is actually producing hydrogen for transportation, for power, and for heating. So and also storage, because hydrogen can be used as a storage medium, because as we all say, when we have renewables, solar, wind, the wind doesn't blow all the time. I mean, today we've got 70 mile an hour winds where I live, which is very unusual, but it doesn't always blow. And the sun doesn't always shine. Not well, in some parts of the world it might, but not everywhere, certainly not in the UK. So hydrogen is a very, very effective way of storing the power when the wind is blowing and when the sun is not shining. So it's got many, many uses. And this just shows the various routes of producing that hydrogen. One thing I did want to finish off with is something that I'm very excited by, which is something we're developing called bio hydrogen. And what that does is it uses our technology, the steam methane reforming, but instead of feeding into that a hydrocarbon, a fossil fuel hydrocarbon, what you do is you feed in a bio feedstock that has been grown that year. So by definition, that feedstock has absorbed CO2 in a short time scale. You then put it through the same process and you produce hydrogen and carbon dioxide. And in that case, even if you do not capture the carbon dioxide, you are effectively net zero, because you're just putting back into the atmosphere the CO2 that was captured in the same time scale, the same year as the feedstock. But if you put carbon capture on the back and turned it into a bio blue hydrogen, you're actually net negative. So you're producing hydrogen and you're taking CO2 out of the atmosphere. So this is something we're spending quite a lot of money on in terms of research and development at the moment. And this is just gives you an idea of the hydrogen demand forecast between now and 2050. This is a percentage increase, so 700% increase from today. Now, in overall terms, that's actually not huge, because when you look at it in comparison to the actual energy demand across the world, hydrogen is a relatively small part, but it just shows the potential growth in hydrogen, and it can have a very significant positive impact on our climate. So I'll finish on that with a slide I like, which just says, what change will you make today? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Damon. It was a very insightful speech. It was technical as well. So I'm sure our participants have some questions to you. Değerli katılımcılar, konuk konuşmacımız Damon Hill'e eğer sorularınız varsa hem chatten yazarak hem de kendisine isterseniz direkt de sorarak iletebilirsiniz. Damon, there is one question in chat. As I have understood, you are providing a solution which is more suitable for linear economy. If we are encouraging shifting to circular economy, do you still think that your technology will be an effective solution? So it's a very good question.
It's a very difficult question. Absolutely. I do think it. When you look at circular economy, I mean, it's a short question, but it's a very long response. I'll try to make it short. Yes, I do think. I mean, it depends. The carbon. If you're talking about carbon capture and sequestration, absolutely. I think I would not want that to be the solution longer term. That is a very quick solution. We have existing technology, and we can obviously take CO2 out of the atmosphere and make a very big impact in a 10 or 15 year timescale. Longer term, it's absolutely correct. The question is spot on, circular economy. So we are working on, that's exactly what the biohydrogen is when you think about it. It's creating a feedstock that is a short time scale, which has captured CO2 through growing on an annual basis. And so it becomes much more of a circular economy. Using renewables as well. And on that topic, we're also looking at plastics recycling. So I mentioned it at the start, plastics recycling. We're working with clients looking at, we're going to need huge amounts of plastics and petrochemicals and products that are good for us as the human race. They're things that create clothes that keep people warm. They help store food. So plastics and petrochemicals and chemicals are not bad things. We just need to create them and use them in a responsible way. So plastics recycling, so that we can use technologies like gasification, pyrolysis, to take what is currently a single-use plastic and actually put it through a process. And we're doing this now, creating a liquid feedstock that can be fed into an existing chemical process to reproduce those chemicals again. That's what we're doing at the moment. So I think the circular economy is exactly right. These things all have to move to a circular economy. We know that when you talk about CO2, there are natural ways that CO2 is taking out of the atmosphere. Rainforests. So we don't need to be globally an absolute net zero emitter of CO2. That we just need to have it in balance. But in the short term, we need to decrease it. And that's why I think the linear approach in terms of sequestration, carbon capture and sequestration, that is very linear, but it's a short-term fix to bring the carbon dioxide levels down over a 15, 20, 30 year period.
Thank you, Damon. There are several questions in the chat. Do you see them?
I can. They're not all questions I can answer, I'm afraid. So there's a good question on what's the cost difference between paying for carbon footprint and investing for carbon capture. I mean, that's, again, a very good question. What we need the cost to be, the tariffs or the incentives to be sufficient. So a carbon tax, and we've got that in Europe. We need that to be such that it makes investing in carbon capture and optimization. And I'd say, I'd like to use the word, rather than carbon capture, I'd like to use the word decarbonisation, because decarbonisation isn't just carbon capture. Carbon capture is just one, is the ultimate. But before you get there, you can apply electrification for assets. You can use renewable power. You can optimize. And typically, we've found that with many oil and gas and energy assets, just through good application of digital technology and good operations, you can easily take 10% out of their energy consumption, which obviously is 10% out of the carbon footprint. So at the moment, I think the only way I can answer that is it's different in different parts of the world. Europe is one area where the carbon tax is beginning to drive companies to look at decarbonisation on a big scale, and carbon capture as well as part of that. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Damon. There are several questions about the regulations as well. Next week, there is a climate conference in Turkey. It will be held in Konya, and the roadmap of Turkish transition to net zero will be decided there. We will be participating to this important meeting as well as WBCSD Turkey. So there are certain regulations needed in Turkey. Also, carbon tax, establishment of a ETS system, they are all on the way. There's one question about financing opportunities on hydrogen investments. Would you like to answer that?
Yeah, it's. I mean, I'll be honest. The regulations we have within my company, we do have. In the consulting groups, we have people who specialize in policy and regulations. We're actually advising the EU at the moment about things like single-use plastics and carbon tax. We also work with the UK government and in the US as well. So, but that's not an area of my expertise, I'm afraid. If anybody wants to talk to somebody, I can certainly arrange that, but it's just not my area of expertise. But what I do know is obviously I know a little bit about it, and it, as I said, it's driven ultimately by government legislation. Of course, it is. There has to be legislation that either incentivizes or applies some form of carbon tax. And the problem is that it can make companies that are trying to export, it can make them uncompetitive if other countries don't do the same, because obviously it introduces costs. So that's why I think that we're struggling to get this required legislation in place globally, because that's what's needed. In terms of hydrogen, yeah, the person who asked the question, Barak, obviously knows about this, because it is the markets that are being created. One of the biggest, I was on an expert panel for hydrogen at ADIPEC in Abu Dhabi last November, and we talked about this, because one of the biggest problems at the moment is that nobody can really define what the market is in the future for hydrogen. Usually when a hydrogen plant is built, it's associated with a specific asset, and so a specific need, like a refinery that needs hydrogen to produce clean fuels and take, or a petrochemicals asset, or a chemicals asset. But the new hydrogen economy is very poorly defined at the moment. Everybody knows we need a lot of hydrogen, but nobody can put a price on it. So at the moment, we've got a lot of companies developing their own green hydrogen or blue hydrogen projects that typically they're turning grey hydrogen into blue hydrogen. We're seeing that on refineries and things like that. With green hydrogen, we're working with a number of clients who are looking at converting and decarbonising their assets specifically, but they're not creating them for export. They're creating them because they can work out roughly that there's an economic benefit over the next 10 or 15 years. When you look at we're talking to clients in places like Chile who are looking at huge investments, because Chile is, I'm told, and I can believe it, a very windy place. So it's a great place to build wind farms. And we're looking with some clients at producing, there and other parts of the world, turning that renewable into green hydrogen. And there's also green ammonia and green methanol. There's all sorts of things you can produce after you've produced the hydrogen. But but these things are going to be exported to other parts of the world. Like Japan is a classic example that currently is probably one of the biggest importers of LNG for power, and it's looking at becoming an importer of hydrogen instead of LNG. And so, but the economics haven't been defined yet. So it's at the moment, a lot of this is in the study phase and the concept and feasibility. But the market pricing is definitely one of the challenges for sure.
Thank you very much, Damon. Thank you. So there are certain questions left, but I would like to move to the next speaker now. If you could answer them in writing, that would be perfect. Damon, there are maybe some companies who would like to connect with you. If you can also write your contact details to chat, please.
Sure.
Evet, thank you very much again, and hopefully talk to you soon. Evet, saygıdeğer katılımcılarımız, şimdi bir sonraki konuşmacımıza geçiyoruz. Teşekkür ederiz. Şimdi bir sonraki konuşmacımız Hannah Locke. Hannah, WBCSD'nin iklim aksiyonları müdürü. Hannah, welcome. Thank you very much for joining us today. The floor is yours.
Hi, lovely to see all of you. I'm going to share my screen now and share all about SOS 1.5. So for those of you who might not be aware, SOS 1.5 is a project within WBCSD, and it's our flagship climate project. And we launched a report last year called the SOS 1.5 Roadmap, and SOS stands for Safe Operating Space, as we aim to keep the global average temperature below 1.5 degrees. And I'm here today to share the details of this roadmap with all of you. So what I'll cover today, so you can see on the right-hand side, I'm Hannah and I'm a manager of climate action at WBCSD. I'm going to talk through what the SOS 1.5 roadmap is and why it exists, and then I'm going to go into detail into how you can transform your company in order to achieve net zero. And then we'll have some Q&As at the end if we have some time. So what's the roadmap and why does it exist? So we know, and we've heard this previously as well, I won't spend too long on some of these slides, but the current efforts are clearly insufficient, and we all really need to act to decarbonise our businesses. You can see we're not on track with 1.5 or 2 degree pathways at the moment. So another reason why the roadmap exists is that many corporations can actually save cash as well as carbon. You can see this abatement cost curve on the left-hand side. You'll note that there are cost savings to be made with regards to renewable power and efficiency. And I'm sure you're all very familiar with this, but companies are also under increasing pressure in a multitude of ways. So we know that we are losing talent if we are not having strong net zero targets, and we're not attracting the right people to come and work at our companies. Investors are pushing more for clarity on ESG scores and roadmaps to decarbonisation because they know that it's linked to future profit. Regulators are really kind of sending signals now that companies need to be reducing carbon too. We of course have civil society and activists that are applying pressure, mobilising online, as well as on the streets to share clearly that they would like companies to take responsibility. And then of course there are shifts in customer demand as well. We know that our products and services sell well when we have clear net zero targets and milestones set. So the roadmap itself, the report on the right-hand side, there's a link there to download, or you can just simply search for SOS 1.5 WBCSD. It's a roadmap to guide companies to take climate action in line with science. It's a step-by-step framework for all companies of any size and sector to build upon and deliver their own decarbonisation journeys. And I think it's really important to note here that no single company can achieve net zero alone, really needs each other, because cross-sector innovation is a key part of decarbonisation. So what we've done at SOS 1.5 is create a platform for companies to come together and look at these different challenges and tackle them together. So at a project level, because obviously I'm representing the project here today, what we do is we create a safe space for our members, because a lot of these the challenges faced are very contentious. They can be quite difficult, and so really peer-to-peer learning is a way to accelerate our own development in reaching and setting net zero goals and then decarbonising. We also facilitate the emergence of new standards so that business can feed into them and have a voice. And then we also incubate end-to-end value chain innovations. So getting to the roadmap, getting to the good stuff. So how to transform your company in order to achieve net zero. So there are key steps and actions that were outlined in the report, which I'll cover briefly today, but they're all quite detailed. And so I'll share some case studies where relevant, but I won't be able to go into full detail on all of it, but I want to give you a good idea of what it contains. So you can see one of the first actions here is to ground ambition in your company purpose. The second is to understand the climate opportunities and risks that your company faces. The third is to set climate targets and milestones for your organization. Fourth, we have build a climate program in line with your company strategy. So that's embedding climate and company strategy together. And then we have mobilizing resources broadly to deliver impact. Lastly, engaging, disclosing, and communicating your climate action. So first, I'll be covering grounding ambition and company purpose. So, oh, there we go, we don't need that slide. So we've got grounding ambition and company purpose, and why is this important? So it's important as a starting point because it's a signal to all stakeholders within the business's remit. So it shows a commitment and it lays a foundation for the starting ground for your decarbonisation journey. It clearly articulates what a company's authentic and distinctive strengths are and what it needs to do to fulfill its needs for society. And then lastly, it provides a purpose and an ambition to inspire and demonstrate to stakeholders, employees, clients, and shareholders that economic performance and positive social contributions are actually complementary to each other. So I've got a really nice recent example of a company that's done this. So you can see on the left-hand side, AB InBevs, which is a drinks company that focuses largely on beer, beverages, US-based. The logo has been developed very recently to launch with the tagline, "To a future with more cheers." And so the global vice president for global brands is kind of articulated on the right-hand side why this purpose and why this change in brand identity might be so important, because at first glance you might not see why. So this new rebrand nods to a future with more innovation, more sustainability, and ultimately a future with more happiness. And that is what AB InBev as a company would like to share with its customers. It's signposts that there are ambitions to reach net zero and have sustainability at the core of its actions. Okay, so next I'm going to talk about climate opportunities and risks and how we understand them. So there are 3 actions in the roadmap that detail how we can assess risk and opportunity. So the first one is that we need to define multiple scenarios of vivid, distinct features for organizations. Usually you would hire a consultancy to run detailed mapping of this. So it's important to have a range of scenarios relevant to the organization to explore the future climate states at risks. How is your value chain going to be impacted in different scenarios? How will you need to build resilience into your value chain? How can you make sure that your risks are reduced as much as possible to not impact your bottom line? Secondly, we have understanding those risks in detail. What are the physical risks, the technological risks, the market and financial risks? And then we have identifying new opportunities in the low carbon economy. So how can your business model be transformed to create low carbon products and services? What is it in your portfolio that needs to go, these tough decisions, and that needs to stay? And then how can we start investing in the capabilities and technologies that we know that we will need in the future? So next, we have setting climate targets and milestones. So firstly, when we set targets, the first action we take is to baseline emissions across the value chain. Now, what this means, for those of you that might not have heard about this before, is you need to understand what the year emissions that you start with before you then plan to reduce. So your baseline, your historic and future emissions across the value chain, establishing a shared reference point. So it's about that reference point of which you need to decarbonize against. Next, we have identifying the new opportunities in a low carbon economy. So how are you going to, and then moving on to identifying and sizing emission reduction levers. So how are you going to actually achieve those targets? What are the milestones and the levers that you're going to draw upon to actually reduce the carbon within your organization? I've got a great example of a net zero case study from Nestle that was shared in the group last year. So Nestle is committing to net zero by 2050 to keep to limit further global temperatures increases. You can see here, they've clearly outlined the different levers that they will be drawing upon to reduce carbon across their business, from sourcing ingredients sustainably, transforming product portfolio, driving towards cleaner logistics, removing carbon in the atmosphere as well, and then using their voice as well to galvanize action. Because climate action doesn't necessarily always mean the tangible elements of your business, it can also be the wider impact that you have. So Nestle engages with other corporates across value to support innovations and reduce carbon emissions. So next, I've got an interesting example from Unilever and their Climate Transition Action Plan. So here, and this slide is actually relevant to other areas of the presentation too. You can see that Unilever has a plan for net zero by 2035 across scopes 1, 2, and 3 carbon emissions. They plan to have a 1.5 aligned science-based target and have that. And then I would encourage you to kind of maybe screenshot or look closer at this slide to think about all of the other areas that Unilever are driving change and action from their own operations right through to governance, data, and disclosure. So now I'm going to talk about how to build a climate program in line with company strategy. So here's a proposed methodology for doing so. The first action you would take is to evolve your competitive advantage based on your climate ambition. So looking back at those targets that you set, what is it that you can do to evolve your competitive advantage in order to reach those? So what are the new business models? How are you attracting the attention of talents and communicating your competitive advantage to climate ambition? How are you working with the ecosystem to mobilize change? Secondly, we've got aligning your corporate strategy and climate agenda. So how are you looking to the future and your vision and objectives? How are you building your portfolio strategy and your growth strategy in line with the climate agenda? So this one is important because sometimes corporate strategy and climate agenda can sit in very different departments. You can have a sustainability manager and sustainability director, chief sustainability officer that's not working directly with the commercial teams and the financial teams. These all need to be, all the teams need to be working together, and climate needs to be spread across the organization. So this is, it's also relevant when we think about how you set up a climate program. So when we mobilize an organization, we need to make sure that decarbonisation levers are implemented. And it's not always the sustainability leads that will be doing that. We'll need to have sign-off from finance. We'll need to make sure that the operations team are involved. So this is a multifaceted operation when it comes to reducing carbon. And it doesn't involve just a sustainability department. It needs to come from the top. And now I'll talk about mobilizing resources broadly to deliver impact. So here, this is a really interesting one. When we think about how we mobilize the organization in more detail, we need to appoint, and on this slide, you'll see that there are different maturity stages. So on the right-hand side, we've got best in class. On the left, we might have, you've just started your journey and you're thinking about what you need to do. So a key action in this area is to ensure delivery by owning this at an executive level. So have you appointed a chief sustainability officer yet in your organization? Because that's really important to have C-suite input and it influence boards with regards to the direction of the company? Have you defined your climate action scorecard? And are you educating and embarking on this journey with your executives? On the right hand side, we see that best in class here is the complete reshape of industry business models. Next, we have committing and prioritizing company resources to deliver the program. So how are you minimizing the discrepancies between those departments? And then on the right hand side, fully shifting the strategy and shifting the portfolio to create new value with regards to climate action. And then next here, we have mobilizing stakeholders across your ecosystem to address barriers. So how are you building this consolidated roadmap and centralizing the steer of the direction? And on the right hand side, how are you deploying those lighthouse initiatives at scale? How are you communicating this with employees and ensuring that you're fully transforming your operating model? And now I'll discuss engaging, disclosing, climate action. So a key action here is to ground ambition in your company purpose. We need to communicate from a basis of transparency, and then lastly, disclose reliable, balanced information on climate action. So there are multiple ways to do this. We think about, so at the bottom of the slide, you'll see that TCFD is noted. We can disclose to CDP. We can make sure that we have an SBTI science-based target. And really this one is about how do we make sure that we aren't just communicating this and keeping this internally, but how are we communicating with shareholders, and how are we communicating this with our customers? Do they know what we're doing? Are we being clear about our ambition and really making sure that everyone knows the direction? I've got an interesting example here from PepsiCo around engagement and disclosure on climate action. So PepsiCo clearly set a science-based target. They made sure that their RE100 commitment was clear with regards to achieving 100% renewable electricity in operations. And they also launched a sustainability report that was available on their website. They answered to CDP, and they also disclosed to TCFD with regards to the financial risks that the company faces. And here's a little bit of a deep dive into their annual reporting system that really goes into detail on the net zero emissions targets, milestones and scopes. So I will stop sharing my screen now, and hopefully I'm to time. If anybody has any questions, I'm happy to answer, and I hope that was helpful.
Thank you very much, Hannah. It was very helpful. Değerli katılımcılarımız, biz chatten de paylaştık. Biz bu dokümanı Türkçe'ye çevirdik ve yayınladık. Tekrar linkini de chatten alabilirsiniz. Evet, Hana'ya sorularınız eminim var. Onları almak için birkaç dakika rica edeceğiz. İsterseniz chatten de yazabilirsiniz ya da görüntünüzü açıp sorabilirsiniz. Birkaç dakika soruları cevaplayalım. Hannah, there was a question about the forest fires, devastating forest fires last summer in Turkey. Of course, this is a devastating stage, and it increases also the carbon footprint of Turkey. It has a huge effect. So what would you recommend to companies in order to design their climate program? Because these type of wildfires are increasing everywhere.
Well, I think so. That's a very big question, and I think one of the main things that we need to do is do a scenario mapping of the risks that are impacting our supply chains, our value chains. So, from a human perspective, we need to be mindful as companies and work with communities that have suffered the aftermath of devastating events like this. From a business perspective, it's important that assets are protected, that assets are not in high risk areas that might be impacted by natural disasters like this. Of course, it's incredibly hard to do that. Nature is not so predictable, but I think it definitely sends a strong message with regards to doing that scenario mapping piece at the beginning, because we need to at least have a good idea of where the risks are that our companies are facing, so that we can be pragmatic and proactive when it comes to managing them.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Evet, Ana risk analizi konusunu önceliklendirdi. Evet, gerçekten risk analizi yapmak çok kritik bir konu. Bizim de bu konuyla ilgili bir çalışmamız daha olacak. Gene WBCSD işbirliğiyle, COSO metodolojisiyle risk analizi nasıl yapılır? Onun da lansmanını 30 Mart'ta yapacağız. Başka bir soru gördüğüm kadarıyla yok. Hannah, thank you very much for joining us today, and thank you very much for giving us the presentation.
It's a pleasure. I would like to just say good luck to everybody that's on this journey. I would like to say good luck with regards to engaging at an executive level and to transforming your businesses. Obviously, this is a huge task that we all face, and we all have to support each other. So if you have questions for SOS 1.5 or you're interested in joining the project, please get in touch.
Thank you. Thank you. Evet, değerli katılımcılarımız, şimdi kapanış konuşması için Yönetim Kurulu Başkanımız Ebru Dildar Edin'e sözü vermek istiyorum. Ebru Hanım, sizi dinlemeye hazırız. Hoş geldiniz.
Selam. Teşekkür ediyorum. Gerçekten bizler için çok önemli bir konu, önemli bir gün. O yüzden bu kapsamda sizlerle beraber olduğum için çok memnunum. Biliyorsunuz SKD Türkiye olarak başlattığımız bu hareket, çatı örgütümüz WBCSD tarafından SOS 1.5 Net Sıfır Karbon İçin Yol Haritası lansmanı olarak sizlerle beraber olduk. İklim kriziyle mücadelede geri dönülmesi imkansız pek çok eşiği aştık. Belki bazı şeyleri sizler kadar bu konulara yakın kişilerle tekrar konuşuyoruz ama her seferinde tekrar bir hatırlatmak istiyorum. Konunun ne kadar vahim olduğunu birlikte görüyor olmamızın, tekrar hatırlıyor, etrafımızla paylaşıyor olmamızın bize sağlayacağı etkileri de göz önünde bulundurarak. Doğal kaynaklarımız tükeniyor. Tüm dünyayı salgın hastalıklar, iklim krizleri etkisi altına alıyor. Artık dünyada hem ülkelerin hem şirketlerin çok ciddi bağlayıcı kararlar alması ve yaptırımlar yapması gereken bir dönemdeyiz. Artık bunu önlemeye yönelik küresel kanun ve politikaların sayısı 2500'ü geçti. Hukuksal boyut kazanan iklim kriziyle ilgili açılmış dava sayısı 1900'ler civarında. Artık bu bir çevre meselesi olmaktan çıktı ve hepimizi, toplumları, iş dünyasını derinden etkileyen bir kalkınma meselesine dönüştü diyebiliriz. Küresel çapta hukuksal bağlayıcılığı olan net sıfır karbon hedeflerine baktığımızda ülkeler çok önemli adımlar attı. İsveç, Almanya 2045'te net sıfır olacağız diyorlar. Fransa, Danimarka, İspanya, Macaristan, Lüksemburg 2050 diyor. Japonya, Kore, Kanada, Yeni Zelanda net sıfıra ulaşmayı taahhüt ediyor ve yasalarını kabul ediyor. İngiltere 2050 yılına kadar yasal bağlayıcılığı olan net sıfır hedefini koydu ama onun yanı sıra da 2035'e kadar emisyonlarını %78 oranında azaltmak için de kısa vadeli hedeflerini verdi. Türkiye olarak bizler 2053 net sıfır karbon emisyon hedefini paylaştık. Bundan sonra artık buna nasıl ulaşacağımızı paylaşma zamanı. Bu senenin sonuna doğru artık bu konuların da daha netleşeceğini görüyoruz. Dolayısıyla çok ciddi bir ajandamız var. Biz de SKD Türkiye olarak bu konunun en temel odak alanımız ve burada hep beraber neler yapacağız? Hem bu konularda farkındalık yaratmak, hem şirketlerin aksiyon alıyor olmasını sağlamak, hem iyi örnekleri duymak ve kendimizi bu kapsamda geliştirmek için de bu ve buna benzer aktiviteleri, panelleri, bilgi paylaştığımız toplantıları düzenlemeye çalışıyoruz. Önümüzdeki hafta birçoğunuz biliyordur, Çevre Şehircilik ve İklim Değişikliği Bakanlığı tarafından İklim Şurası düzenlenecek. Burada kamu kurumları, yerel yönetimler, üniversiteler, iş dünyası, uluslararası kuruluşlar, özel sektör ve diğer sivil toplum kuruluşları temsilcileriyle beraber biz de SKD Türkiye olarak yer alacağız. Bu şurada sera gazı azaltımı nasıl olacak, yeşil finansmanlar, karbon fiyatlaması, iklim değişikliğine uyum, yerel yönetimler, göç, adil geçiş, diğer sosyal politikalarla bilim ve teknoloji konuları da ele alınacak. O yüzden çok önemli bu şura sonuç bildirgesinin 2053 net sıfır emisyon ve yeşil kalkınma hedefleri doğrultusunda hazırlanacak kısa, orta ve uzun vadeli strateji, eylem, politika ve mevzuatların altyapısını oluşturmasını bekliyoruz. Umarım bu konuda sonuç hedeflerde çıkacaktır. Biz de bu yaptığımız çalışmalarda da bugün konuştuğumuz Hedef Net Sıfır Karbon sloganıyla başlattığımız Net Sıfır Karbon Hareketinin ülkemizin net sıfır emisyon hedefine katkımızı arttırmayı hedefliyoruz. Amacımız net sıfır karbon hedefi veren üye sayımızı arttırarak ülkemizin 2053 hedefine ulaşmasına destek olmak. Bu zorlu hedefi bir an önce ulaşmak istiyoruz bu hedefe. Bu konuda iş dünyasının yeşil dönüşümüne de yol göstermek istiyoruz. Çok şanslıyız. Çatı örgütümüz bu konuda geçen sene çalışmasını yaptı ve bizim için çok önemli bir kaynak olabilecek bir araç SOS 1.5 net sıfır karbon için yol haritasını bizlerle paylaştı. Biz de bu yolculukta bu haritayı kendimize kılavuz olarak belirledik. Bu kılavuzda 5 ana adım, 16 eylemden oluşan bir yol haritası var. Hepimizin bildiği küresel ısınmanın insanlar ve doğa üzerindeki yıkıcı etkilerinden kaçınmayı ve dünyayı sürdürülebilir ve sağlıklı bir geleceğe taşımayı hedefliyor ve bunun için de 1,5 derecenin altında tutmayı da zorunlu olduğumuzun tekrar altını çiziyor. Çok sayıda geniş kitlelere ulaşmak hedef. Biz de bunu sizlerle paylaşarak önümüzdeki dönemde sizlerin kendi stratejilerinizi oluşturmasında katkı sağlamayı hedefliyoruz. Özellikle konuştuk ama tekrarlamak istiyorum bazı konuları. SOS 1.5 yol haritası ile şirketlere karbon ayak izini, net sıfır karbon emisyonları hedefine taşımaya yönelik stratejileri geliştirmeyi, düşük karbon ekonomisine geçişin önündeki engellerin birlikte tespit edilmesi ve ortadan kaldırılmasına yardımcı olmayı, değer zincirinin ve tedarik zincirinin aynı doğrultuda da seferber edilmesi çerçevesinde rehberlik etmeyi hedefliyor olacağız. Aynı zamanda bu raporla birlikte şirketlerin düşük karbon uygulamalarına geçmeleri konusunda toplumun farklı kesimlerinden gittikçe artan bir baskı hissettiklerini de görüyoruz. Yatırımcılar, düzenleyici kurumlar, çalışanlar, müşteriler ve toplum başta olmak üzere tüm paydaşların şirketlerden iklim eylemine odaklı bir şekilde katılmaları yönünde beklentileri de var. Bu baskıları da iklim değişikliğinin negatif etkilerini daha somut bir şekilde görünür hale geldikçe giderek arttıracağı da kuşkusuz. Bu artışın sektörlerde yarattığı belirsizliğin önüne geçilmesi için şirketlerin alternatif gelecek senaryoları kapsamında iş faaliyetlerini nasıl gerçekleştireceklerini değerlendirmelerini çok iyi anlamaları gerekiyor. Biz de bu kıymetli uygulama kılavuzuyla hem şirketin amacıyla bu hedefin bütünleşmesini, riskleri ve fırsatların oluşturulmasını, net sıfır karbon hedefinin ve kilometre taşlarının belirlenmesi, hedef orada ama oralara nasıl gideceğimizin belirlenmesini, hem iklim eylemine katılma ve bilgi paylaşımı, iletişiminin nasıl yapılacağı, etki yaratmak için kaynakları harekete geçirmeyi ve şirket stratejisiyle uyumlu bir iklim programının da oluşturulması için yol göstermeyi hedefliyor olacağız. İklim krizinde geldiğimiz nokta artık aciliyete geldi. Kriz diyoruz, aciliyet diyoruz. Çok hızlı önlem almak gerektiğinde farkındayız. Üyelerimiz başta olmak üzere tüm şirketleri iklim liderliğinde cesur bir adım atmaya davet ediyoruz. Elimizdeki bu kıymetli araçla gerçekleştireceğimiz yeşil dönüşüm ülkemizin 2053 hedefine katkı sağlarken uygulayıcı şirketlerin Avrupa Birliği mutabakatı çerçevesinde ticarette yeşil dönüşüm fırsatlarını yakalamasına da imkan sağlayacaktır diye inanıyoruz. Bu hareketi değerli üyelerimizin sürdürülebilirlik konusundaki kararlılığından aldığımız güçle başlattığımızı ve büyük bir heyecan duyduğumuzu da ayrıca belirtmek istiyorum. Tüm üyelerimizi ve paydaşlarımızı net sıfır karbon hareketine katılarak Türkiye'nin dönüşüm yolculuğuna kararlılıkla ve hep birlikte katkı sağlamaya da davet ediyoruz. Teşekkür ediyorum.
Ebru Hanım çok teşekkürler. Gerçekten harika bir konuşmaydı. Herkesi de cesaretlendirdiniz. Evet, ben hem Hakan Bey'e hem Dr. Damon Hill'e hem Hana Loka hem de Ebru Hanım'a çok çok teşekkür ediyorum. Değerli katılımcılarımız, bugün Net Sıfır Karbon Hareketini başlatıyoruz SKD Türkiye olarak. Katıldığınız için, bizim bu heyecanımızı bizlerle paylaştığınız için çok teşekkür ediyoruz. Önümüzde uzun bir yol var ama önemli olan kararlılıkla adım atmaya başlamak. Biliyorsunuz, başlamak işin yarısıdır. Biz de bu süreçte hepinize yardımcı olacağız. Programımızın kaydını ve programda yapılan sunumları sizlerle paylaşacağız. Aynı zamanda biliyorsunuz SOS 1.5 yol haritamız Türkçe'ye çevrildi. Onu da sizlerle chatten de paylaştık. Web sitemizde de var. Çok teşekkür ediyoruz ve ülkemiz için net sıfır karbon yolculuğunda bu önemli kilometre taşında bizlerle birlikte olduğunuz için tekrar saygılar sunuyoruz. Görüşmek üzere.